Hello dear students, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. So we all knew that today is 14th June 2024 and we have few very important and very interesting news articles for today's discussion. Now without any further delay, let's start our discussion, and before discussing them, yesterday I've given you one practice question for prelims examination and we'll try to solve that question before proceeding into the analysis part of today's newspaper, right? So the question that I have given to you yesterday was a very important question, and I have already told you that. So we have discussed this initiative on critical and emerging technologies when we are discussing about India-US relations specifically 2 days back. So therefore, this particular initiative on critical and emerging technologies was an initiative between India and the United States. So therefore, the correct answer for this question is option A, United States. United States is the correct answer for this question. Now, when it was launched, India-US initiative on critical and emerging technologies. So in May 2022, India and US jointly announced this India-US initiative on critical and emerging technologies. In short, this is also known as initiative of ISET. So ISET is an initiative on critical and emerging technologies. So this particular initiative was launched to elevate and expand the strategic technology partnership and at the same time the defense industrial cooperation between India and US businesses and academic institutions between these two countries. So this is what the ISET initiative, the initiative of critical and emerging technologies. Now when we talk about this ISET initiative, so it has certain priority areas. Total it has identified 6 priority areas. Now what are those 6 priority areas? So they include defense, space, quantum technology, artificial intelligence, semiconductors and telecommunications. So these are the 5 sectors that are included or that are considered as a priority sectors as part of this initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Now today also I have given a very important practice question, and remember that this question also I have discussed in yesterday's class, right? So the question was the Satnamis, a sect comprising of peasants, artisans and untouchables, rebelled against the mighty Mughal Empire during the reign of which of the following Mughal emperor? Now this is a very important question, and as I have already told you that yesterday I have discussed this Satnamis sect. So therefore try to answer this question in the comment section and I'll be providing you the correct answer in tomorrow's class. Now we'll start this discussion with first a very important topic, that is a decline in the value of rupee and how economic turbulence has fueled the decline in rupee, and what are the spin-off effects because of the economic turbulence and rupee decline on economic growth, economic development and external trade, and how it is going to impact India's competitiveness. So generally, so whenever we say that a decline in rupee value would further fuel exports from a country, right? So what exactly is the context? The context is that recent economic turbulences that our economy has been experiencing, particularly because of the lockdown was the one reason, right? So the lockdown was the one reason, and the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the COVID-19 pandemic we have experienced the supply chain disruptions in the supply chain. So therefore this recent economic turbulences to an unprecedented decline in the value of Indian rupee. So decline in a value of Indian rupee has led to the concerns among the investors and the policy makers also. Now on this image you can clearly see how can a rupee appreciates or depreciates. Now appreciation of rupee is increasing the value of rupee and depreciation of rupee is decreasing the value of the rupee. Now the following factors actually influences rupee's appreciation and depreciation. The first very important factor is interest rate, right? So interest rate actually plays a very important role in either depreciating the currency or appreciating the currency. So India with an interest rate of 6 to 7 percentage attracts greater capital inflows from other countries into India, because most of the foreign institutional investors invest in India. Okay, so with the expectations that their investments in India would give them better returns rather than their earnings in the US, and because of that reason the foreign institutional investors very often interested in investing in India, because they might get better returns on their investments in India. Okay, because if you look at the interest rate in US, it is just 2 to 3 percentage, but on the other hand in India it is around 6 to 7 percentage of interest rate on their investments in India. So whenever a huge amount of forex reserves coming into the Indian economy as investments, so that would certainly increases the strength of the rupee, so that will lead to the appreciation of the rupee. However, due to the a recession or economic slowdown or any other reason, if there is a flight of capital out of Indian economy, that will also lead to the depreciation of Indian currency. Now, apart from the above mentioned interest rates, inflation rate also have a significant impact on the either appreciation or depreciation of rupee value. Now, what is inflation? Inflation is a general increase in the level of prices, general increase in the level of prices in an economy, right? So that is known as inflation. So this definition of inflation is very well known to us. So whenever the prices increases, that condition or that situation is known as inflation. Now, inflation is caused by two different factors. One is cost push inflation and second one is demand pull inflation. So these are two types of inflation which causes increase in the prices of any economy, right? So whenever there is an increase in the prices of goods, so that will lead to the reduction in demand. It will lead to the reduction in demand for those goods, right? So decline in the demand for goods, what it translates? So it translates slow down of growth, slow down of growth, and that is where it will lead to the flight of capital out of Indian economy. Now whenever, so as I've already explained you that whenever there is a huge forex reserves coming into the Indian economy as an investment, that will appreciate India's currency value. But whenever there is an excessive flight of forex reserves out of Indian economy, that will also leads to the depreciation of India's currency value. Okay, so that is how inflation also have a major impact on the currency value, especially the Indian rupee value. A country with the lower inflation would have an increased demand, because lower inflation essentially means that the prices of all goods under control. So whenever the prices of all the goods under control, there will be an increased demand for those goods, because the prices for those goods have not increased, right? So increased demand for its products by the foreign buyers and higher demand for goods and services would result in currency appreciation in India. Now apart from that, the third factor is export and import. Now whenever we export large number of goods to other countries, so when we are exporting goods to other countries, they will provide us with the forex reserves, right? So therefore the overall forex reserves in India will significantly improve, and that will help in the appreciation of rupee value. However, whenever there is an imbalance between exports and imports, whenever we start importing more rather than exporting more, so that will lead to the for example, imagine that we have $100 in our forex reserves. When we have $100 in our forex reserves, we are importing more goods rather than whatever we are exporting. Now whenever we are importing, for example, we are importing medical devices from any other country. So whenever we import medical devices, we have to pay a certain sum of dollars. For example, we need to pay $20 to other country from which we have imported these medical devices. Now we have only $80, so that will lead to the increased demand for dollars and reduction in the value of the rupee. So that is how the rupee value either appreciates or depreciates based on these factors. Okay, now apart from that, we will also understand, wait, yeah, sorry for that. Okay, so now we'll understand some domestic factors. Okay, so there are certain domestic factors. So these domestic factors are actually responsible for the economic slowdown, and apart from economic slowdown, these domestic factors are also responsible for the decline in the rupee value. Now as we have already understood, for example, interest rates, inflationary pressures, and export and import, and these domestic factors are also have a close association with those factors that we have already talked about, right? So first and foremost, inflationary pressures and commodity prices are exceptionally high, right? So for example, what are these inflationary prices? So inflationary pressures, so that essentially means that there is an increase in the prices of goods and services, and this condition is known as what? This condition is known as inflation. Now in inflation, the prices of goods and services increases. Now increasing prices will lead to the low demand in the economy. We all knew about that. Increasing prices will lead to the low demand. Now low demand essentially translates that over a period of time the production will decline in the economy. The production will decline. So low production means that will lead to the job losses, because whenever they are producing less, whenever any industry producing less, so there is no need for a higher number of employees in that company. So in order to reduce their expenditure, they start firing the existing employees. So that will lead to the job losses. And along with the job losses, lower production means lower export, and in fact it will lead to the slow economic growth and also may lead to the recession like conditions. So that is how in fact the inflationary trends and even the increasing commodity prices. For example, imagine that there is an industry A, and this industry A uses active pharmaceutical ingredients as a raw material for manufacturing drugs. So whenever the API price has significantly increased, they will also increase the prices of these commodities or these products. Okay, so the increasing inflationary pressures and commodity prices will lead to the increasing inflation, and these commodity prices, especially the raw material prices, have actually eroded the purchasing power of the rupee, right? For example, now imagine that for example, there is some product A, and this product can be purchased with just 100 rupees earlier, but due to inflationary pressures and increasing commodity prices, now we need to spend 110 rupees to purchase the same amount of goods. So this essentially means that it has eroded the purchasing power of the rupee. And after that, there are also fiscal deficit concerns and the policy stance of the government. Now what exactly is this fiscal deficit? Now whenever we talk about this fiscal deficit, so fiscal deficit essentially means that the total difference between expenditure and revenue minus total borrowings. So that is known as the fiscal deficit. Now the fiscal deficit and policy stance of the government actually undermined the investor confidence also, because we already have the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act to limit the fiscal deficit of the government. But on the other hand, we have experienced this COVID-19 pandemic. And along with the COVID-19 pandemic, if we look at the banking sector, so banking sector has also been facing problems like NPAs, right? So because of all these challenges, the government has started borrowing more, and whenever the government has been started borrowing more, so there will be more debt on the government, and in fact it will also reduces the overall sustainability of the economy in the longer term, because whenever we have more debt, then the government have to spend more on paying interest rates and also the principal amount over a period of time. Okay, so the interest rate and interest amount and the principal amount must be paid through the forex reserves, and that will also lead to the slow economic growth, because whenever the government has been paying the interest rates or servicing the debt that it has already borrowed, then the welfare expenditure of the government would be substantially less. Along with the welfare expenditure, the expenditure on the new infrastructure creation would also be significantly lesser. So therefore this is another hurdle. And after that, there are also some supply chain disruptions in recent times. Okay, so as of now, the Indian government has been planning to ensure supply chain resilience. So because because of the learnings that we have, experiences that we have learned from COVID-19 pandemic, where we have experienced this supply chain disruptions. Okay, so now what we wanted to achieve, supply chain resilience, so that we can deal with the disruptions in supply chain. And these disruptions have also significantly increased or created economic challenges and impacting the overall rupee's value also. See, whenever there are frequent supply chain disruptions, then the economy would prone to the both most probably the cost push inflation, right? So cost push inflation in the sense that the raw material cost would be significantly higher, so whenever there is an increase in the prices of raw material costs, then the companies would start increasing the prices of the products also, and that is where it will lead to the inflationary pressures in the economy. So apart from that, there are certain international factors also. What are those important international factors? First and foremost, we need to talk about the global COVID-19 pandemic impact, right? So we all knew that how disruptive this COVID-19 pandemic. So therefore, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a long lockdowns across the world, and that has reduced the demand for Indian exports. So when everywhere there are lockdowns, then the purchasing power of the people would be significantly less, and because of that reason, the demand for Indian exports in other countries was also significantly lesser. And apart from that, in recent times, there were protectionist trends. Protectionism was growing at an alarming rate across the world, mostly in West. And apart from that, the global trade restrictions affected India's external trade balance and currency reserves also. So for example, we need to talk about the trade war between India and US and India and China. So to some extent, that has also impacted India's exports into other countries. Now whenever we start exporting more goods into other countries, we would earn more forex reserves. So when we have more forex reserves, so that would significantly increases the value of the rupee. A strong rupee is very, very important for stable economic growth in the longer term. Now the protectionism more specifically visible in the West European countries, and in fact US and Canada. So they have also gone through this protectionist tendencies. And if you look at India's trade, where we have enjoying the trade surplus is mostly with the European countries. So whenever they follow this protectionist trends, that would certainly impacts India's trade interests and India's exports also. So however, when we talk about the economic activity and reserves, the forex reserves that we have so far, and in fact, at the global level, it is generally said that there is a reduced economic activity in recent times across the world. So why there is a reduced economic activity? There are back-to-back setbacks for the global economy. First, it is because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this was the one reason. And apart from COVID-19 pandemic, we have also experienced this Russia-Ukraine war. And after Russia-Ukraine war, we have also gone through the Gaza Strip and Israel conflict. So this Gaza Strip and Israel conflict further leads to the Red Sea crisis. So all these factors have reduced the economic activity globally and also added pressure on rupee's value and even the currency reserves also. Now, what was the response and urgency for these structural reforms? So why there is a need for such a structural reforms? Right. So first and foremost, we need to understand the response to prevent the sliding down of rupee value. Now, RBI time to time intervenes to prevent the declining value of the rupee. So RBI's intervention should be seen as a measure to stabilize the currency, but it also faces its own challenges. Now, how RBI intervenes to prevent the declining rupee value, right? So RBI also holds a certain amount of forex reserves with it, and whenever RBI feels that the rupee value is declining, RBI sells its forex reserves in the market, and that will help stabilize the rupee value. And after that, there is also a downward trajectory in the Indian economy. So despite there were a lot of efforts from the government side to ensure the robust growth and development of Indian economy, the rupee's downward trajectory still continues because of the domestic and a combination of domestic and at the same time the international factors. So therefore there is a need for structural reforms that must be carried out in the Indian economy. So these structural reforms will help Indian economy to become more stable, and at the same time we will be able to export goods and services and ensure that the inflationary pressures and at the same time the external influences on Indian economy can be effectively managed. However, as I have already told you that there is a need for structural reforms, and in this context the policy makers must sit together and they must assess the present Indian economy and economic prospects, and they should also think about the structural reforms, and those structural reforms will help boost productivity and at the same time restore the investor confidence as well. So that is the overall objective. Now the next very important article is with respect to the global fight over the climate finance. Now briefly I will explain you what exactly is climate finance. Okay, so what exactly is this climate finance? Climate finance essentially means that, now a brief background is that, so world is divided into developed countries and developing countries. Okay, so we all knew that developed countries and the developing countries. So whenever we talk about these developed countries, what are those developed countries? For example, US and the European countries are known as the developed countries. So along with the European countries, Japan is a developed country, and South Korea is a developed country, Australia is also a developed country, and New Zealand is also a developed country. So these are the countries which are known as developed countries. But on the other hand, there are certain developing countries, right? So what are those developing countries? For example, countries which are part of South Asia plus Africa and also Latin American countries. So these countries are known as the developing countries. Right, when we talk about the developed and developing countries, so it is a very well known fact that the present levels of climate change, the developed countries are mostly responsible for the present levels of climate change rather than the developing countries. Now these developed countries are rich countries, and they have they have the capacity to deal with the negative impacts of the climate change, and they also have the technology to mitigate the negative impacts of the climate change. But on the other hand, when we talk about the developing countries, first and foremost they lack capacity to deal with the negative impacts of climate change, and they lack finances, and they also lack the necessary technology, right? So they lack technology, they lack finances, and they also lack the capacity to deal with the climate change. So that is what we need to understand here. Now all these developing countries collectively demanding the developed countries to finance for the negative impacts of climate change, and help these developing countries to deal with the climate change, because they are rich and most of the people who are living in these developed countries have been enjoying a good living standard. So because of that reason, the developing countries collectively demanding finances from the developed countries to ensure that they will have adequate capacity, adequate finances and technology to deal with the negative impacts of climate change, and that is known as climate finance. I hope it is very clear for you. So this is the global fight over the climate finance. Now, what is the context of this particular editorial or news article? The context is that the upcoming UN COP29 climate summit. Okay, so there will be COP29 climate summit that is going to be held in November, and this particular COP21 climate summit is gearing up to address the most important issue, that is global climate finance. The global climate finance is the developed countries financing the developing countries to develop their capacity, their finances and also their technologies to deal with the climate change. And in fact, it is expected that nearly 200 countries would attend this UN COP29 meeting, and discussions are also underway to establish a new global funding goal to combat this climate change, because we all knew that climate change is a challenge that the 21st century mankind has been facing. Now again, I will be emphasizing on climate finance. What exactly is this climate finance? So climate finance actually refer to the financial support which is being provided by the wealthier nations. Now in this case, what are those wealthier nations? The developed countries are wealthier nations. So therefore, it is a financial support which is being provided by the wealthier nations to developing countries and least developed countries and small island developing states to invest in projects. Okay, so these projects would enhance the capacity of the developing countries and help them reduce their emissions into the atmosphere. Okay, so the overall objective of climate finance is to develop the capacities of developing countries and at the same time help these developing countries in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So this is climate finance and this is the objective of climate finance. However, the climate funding is very crucial for these developing countries, as I've already told you that these developing countries are in a disadvantaged position. So therefore, in order to implement sustainable initiatives and to cope up with extreme weather events that these developing countries have been facing, climate finance is very important, right? So now what is the need for a new goal of climate finance? Right, so the current goal which is set in 2009 pledged 100 billion. Okay, so this pledge which was set in 2009 pledged 100 billion annually from year 2020 to 2025 solely for climate finance. However, now if you look at the global climate stance, so there is a worsening climate change and at the same time there is also an insufficient clean energy investments in these developing nations. So in fact, the estimates among these developing countries to set up a new project have skyrocketed, and therefore it is virtually impossible to reduce greenhouse gases if the developed countries not come up with a more aggressive financing of these projects in developing countries. And in fact, various reports have been suggesting that $2.4 trillion per year will be needed by 2030. Okay, so if we spend around $2.4 trillion per year, only then we will be able to meet all the climate goals. Now one important climate goal I would like to mention here is COP21 Paris Summit. So this COP21 Paris Summit has emphasized on reducing the greenhouse gases well below 2 degrees Celsius of the pre-industrial levels, and if possible we have to reduce it to 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels, right? So therefore, in order to achieve this objective of limiting global warming, and at the same time in order to fulfill the commitments of different countries, for example, most of the European Union countries have announced that they will become net zero by around 2050, and in fact China announced that it will become net zero by 2060, followed by India 2070. So in order to achieve all these climate goals, and at the same time to protect the vulnerable societies from the negative impacts of the climate change, we have to spend a huge amount of finances on the mitigation and adaptation. However, when we talk about the proposed funding targets, so ahead of this COP29 summit, so various proposals have been put forward regarding the new global goal. So Arab Group, which is a group of different Arab countries in West Asia, suggested that 1.1 trillion annually, with a significant portion should be coming directly from the developed countries, because developed countries are mostly responsible for the present levels of climate change, because now developed countries have the necessary technology, necessary finances, and the people in these developed countries are also enjoying comparatively higher degree of living standards than the people in the developing countries. So therefore, the majority or the lion's share of funds should come from the developing countries. Similarly, India and African nations, and most of these nations are considered as developing states, poor and underdeveloping states. So they are advocating that 1 trillion annually required, with differing views on funding sources. So these are the views of different countries with respect to the funding. However, the climate finance is not an easy task to do. In fact, there are a lot of differences and diverse views with respect to climate finance on both developing and developed countries. However, in this context, there are certain challenges with respect to the climate finance. Now, what are those challenges? First and foremost, obligation for funding among these developed countries. So who should shoulder the major burden with respect to the climate finance? Now, a major debate that has been revolving around the countries. So which countries should contribute to the climate finance? So this is very important. Whether developed countries should contribute to the climate finance, or the developing countries, and within developed countries also there are small countries and also countries with a huge economies of scale. So therefore, there are a lot of differences in this regard. So currently, only a few wealthy nations are obligated to provide funding. Okay, so not all countries are ready to provide climate funding, but only few countries are ready to provide climate funding. So therefore, it has been leading to the calls for an updated list. So different countries have been coming forward and they are saying that there should be an updated list of countries. So which countries should contribute to the climate finance. So it should not just be the responsibility of the developed countries, but it should also the developing countries like China should also share the major burden of the climate finance. And in fact, these countries, the developed countries, have also advocating and demanding that China and countries with high GDP per capita nations should also be part of this list which finances the climate goals. So however, this proposal faces a strong resistance, particularly from China. So China is still claiming itself as a developing country. So it is not ready to be part of the list of developed countries. And after that, we need to define the climate finance. So there is also different views among different parties with respect to the definition of climate finance. So this is another most important challenge, so that is defining the climate finance. So in fact, most public funding currently consisting of loans, and when we talk about the climate finance, and most of the climate finance is sourced through loans. And in fact, so whenever the poor countries, the developing countries and underdeveloped countries, whenever they are sourcing these funds through loans, that will significantly increases the debt burden on those poor countries. And apart from that, additionally, there are some debates which are centering around whether these commitments to cut fossil fuel subsidies should be reflected in the funding goal or not. So therefore, a lot of challenges. However, we have to be seen how this COP29 summit going to address this climate finance issue, because in order to meet all the climate goals across the world, it is very important that we need to have a sustainable financing mechanism where all the countries should be ready, especially the developed countries should be ready to contribute on their part to reduce the climate change and its negative impacts on the vulnerable sections of the society. So next, a very important article is with respect to heat waves. Right, so heat waves is a very important phenomenon. It has become a very important phenomenon in India, especially during this summer, because a severe heat wave like condition has led to the killing of hundreds of people across the country. However, the problem is that even though heat wave has been emerging as a most important disaster or most significant disaster, so it is unfortunate that the National Disaster Management Act has not included heat wave or not considered heat wave as a one of the disaster. We will understand about this. Okay, so we all knew that in recent times, so India has been going through a severe heat wave like condition, and that has been led to the killing of hundreds of individuals. So therefore, we can say that this North India recently grappled with the longest heat wave. Now, what was the reason for the heat wave? Climate change is the reason. It was the main reason for the heat wave. And apart from climate change, the anthropogenic factors such as pollution in those urban areas, and apart from pollution, we also recently discussed about this urban heat island effect. So this urban heat island effect has also been contributing to the increasing heat wave conditions. So therefore, despite severity in heat waves and increasing intensity and frequency of these heat waves across the country, the heat waves remain excluded from the Disaster Management Act of 2005. This is very important. You must understand this. So despite increasing frequency and intensity of heat waves, so they are still excluded from the Disaster Management Act. So because of the exclusion of the heat waves from the Disaster Management Act, so it deprives the states accessing the disaster response funds. So they are not able to access the disaster response funds. Now it is very important that all these states must frame heat wave action plans across different levels, the state level, district level, block levels. So they must undertake these heat wave action plans to mitigate the negative impacts of these heat waves. So in order to undertake the necessary measures to deal with the heat wave, they should be able to access funds of this disaster response. So disaster response fund was created through this Disaster Management Act. Now if states cannot access funds in this disaster response fund, how can they mitigate the negative impacts of the heat wave conditions? So that is one of the real challenge here. Now what is this Disaster Management Act? Now when we talk about this Disaster Management Act of 2005, so it was enacted to specifically address the catastrophes arising from both natural and man-made causes. So whatever disasters, catastrophes which are being caused by both natural and man-made causes will be addressed or will be dealt by the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And in fact, it established a National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority and even the District Disaster Management Authority at a decentralized manner across different levels. So all these bodies will oversee the disaster response across different levels, right? So these organizations were established by the National Disaster Management Act. Now the National Disaster Management Act actually includes provisions for funds such as National Disaster Response Fund and at the same time the State Disaster Response Fund also. Now, the problem is that heat wave is not included as a notified disaster under the Disaster Management Act, and that is the main challenge. So since heat wave is not a notified disaster under this particular legislation, the state governments are not able to access funds in the National Disaster Response Fund and State Disaster Response Fund to undertake measures to mitigate the negative impacts of heat wave. Right, so we'll understand what are these notified disasters. Right, so notified disasters as per the National Disaster Management Act are certain catastrophic events beyond coping capacity of these communities. Now, communities will not be able to cope up with such disasters whenever those disasters takes place, and it will lead to a substantial loss of life, property, and damage to the environment is being caused by such disasters. Also on the right you can see the disaster management cycle. So disaster management cycle involves various phases. So first, preparation, response, recovery, and long-term mitigation. Right, so this is the disaster management cycle, and it is very important whenever you write an answer, so you must draw that diagram in your answer. So however, some of the notified disasters as part of the National Disaster Management Act includes the cold waves, earthquakes, cyclones, floods, and other disasters. So these are some of the notified disasters which are included in the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. And in fact, so whenever these disasters struck the states can access funds like National Disaster Response Fund and State Disaster Response Fund for relief and recovery efforts. Okay, so through these funds, both national and central and state governments can ensure the relief and recovery efforts for these disasters. However, when we talk about the heat waves, in recent times, the frequency and intensity of these heat waves has been significantly increasing. So because of global warming and even urbanization, so urbanization lead to the urban heat island effect, increased levels of pollution and construction dust. So all these factors have been leading to the increased intensity of these heat waves. So however, they were not considered as disasters. Heat wave is not considered as a disaster under the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. And in fact, when we talk about the heat waves, there are around 23 vulnerable states across the country. So these 23 states are also facing extreme risk for this heat related illness. And since there is an extreme risk for majority of these states, there is an urgent and immediate need to address heat waves in disaster management so that the state governments can access funds under this National Disaster Response Fund and State Disaster Response Fund, and they can also undertake the relief measures for these heat waves. However, there are a lot of demands from the state governments to the center that heat wave must be recognized, identified, or notified as a disaster. And in fact, the 15th Finance Commission did not include heat waves as a notified disaster for the devolution of finances. So what was the reason that the 15th Finance Commission has cited to deny heat waves to be included in the disaster, notified disaster, is the existing list covering state needs adequately. So therefore there is no need to include heat waves in the notified disasters list. However, there are a lot of states like Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, and Kerala. So they have designed heat waves as local disasters, even though they were not identified or recognized as a notified disasters. So these states identified disasters. These states actually identified the heat waves as local disasters and allowing them to access funds for relief efforts. And this is also a very important chart here. So you can go through the different disasters, and those disasters will come under which particular ministry. For example, whenever we talk about the cyclone comes under the nodal ministry of earth sciences. So whenever you talk about drought, so drought comes under Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. Just pause the video and go through all these disasters. So the next very important topic is tax devolution. Okay, now we'll understand what exactly is this tax devolution and how this tax devolution is being done between center and state governments. So we will understand this in a clear manner. Now first and foremost, we'll understand what is tax devolution. Now whenever we talk about this tax devolution, so it is a dissolution advising a formula to distribute union tax proceeds between union and states. Now Article 280 provides for the Finance Commission, and this Finance Commission is formed by President every 5 years, right? So this Finance Commission is formed by the President every 5 years. Now what is the major function of the Finance Commission? The Finance Commission actually decides the devolution of taxes between the center and state governments. So that is the major function of the Finance Commission. Now whenever we talk about the tax devolution, it is advising a formula to distribute union tax proceeds between union and the states. So that is known as tax devolution, right? So in fact, it is the most important task of the Finance Commission, which is being constituted under Article 280 of the Constitution, as the share of states in the net proceeds of the union taxes is the predominant channel of resource transfer from the center to states. So this is briefly about the tax devolution. Now we'll understand the context first. So what is the context? The context is that recently the center decided to release an additional installment of tax devolution. So tax devolution share of states along with their due share for June 2024. And it is believed that around 1,39,715 crore is being transferred to the states this month as part of this tax devolution from the union government to state governments. Now we will understand what is this divisible pool of taxes. What exactly is this divisible pool of taxes? So the divisible pool of taxes actually refers to the portion of tax revenue which is being collected by the union government that is shared between the center and states. For example, imagine that 100 rupees was the total revenue collected by the central government. So in order to divide the devolution, this 100 rupees not belong to the center. Now Finance Commission would be appointed by the President under Article 280 of the Constitution, right? So after Finance Commission is being appointed, this Finance Commission will decide a formula for the devolution of these 100 rupees between the center and state governments. Okay, so that is the divisible pool of taxes between center and states. Now what constitutes this divisible pool of taxes? Now what kind of a taxes which are collected by the center comes under the divisible pool of taxes? So it actually encompasses various taxes. So various taxes including the corporation tax, the personal income tax, central goods and service tax, and also the center's share of the integrated goods and services tax. So all these together forms part of the central divisible pool of taxes, and from the central divisible pool of taxes the Finance Commission would recommend between the center and state governments. Now however, on the other hand, we also have cess and surcharge. Now cess and surcharge is an additional levies on the existing tax which is being imposed on the goods. However, even though the cess and surcharge are being imposed by the government, they are not part of the divisible pool of taxes, right? So it is being imposed and collected by the central government, right? So collected by the central government. So even though these things are collected by the central government, so cess and surcharge does not comes part of the, or it does not become part of the divisible pool of taxes. That you have to understand here. Now after that we'll understand the role of the finance commission. Now what is the role of the finance commission in devolution of these taxes? Now under article 280 of the constitution, the division of this divisible pool of taxes. Now divisible pool of taxes constitutes corporation tax and personal income tax and central share of central GST, right? Central GST, and at the same time the central share of the IGST. So central share of the IGSTs, all these forms part of the divisible pool of taxes, and the finance commission would actually devise a formula for the division in this divisible pool of taxes. So that is being determined by the finance commission, so which is constituted every 5 years by the president, right? So apart from distributing the tax revenue by the finance commission, so the finance commission also recommends grants in aid to the certain states which have been going through the revenue deficit. Okay, so this is an additional responsibility on the part of the finance commission, because those states economy or those states will not fall under the debt burden. Okay, so whenever any state facing a severe revenue deficit, the finance commission would also recommend grants in aid to those states. Now whenever we talk about the composition of this finance commission, so finance commission comprises of chairman and 4 other members. So total it is a 5-member body, and in fact the members are eligible for the reappointment by the president. So the qualification for the members are specified in the Finance Commission Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 1951, right? So this is with respect to the finance commission. So and next, a very important article is with respect to Indian Army introduces Vidyut Rakshak. Now we will understand what exactly is this Vidyut Rakshak, right? So the context is that the Indian Army has unveiled Vidyut Rakshak. Now this Vidyut Rakshak is a cutting edge innovation which is being developed by Army Design Bureau. So this Army Design Bureau has developed this Vidyut Rakshak. Okay, so what was the overall aim of this Vidyut Rakshak that is being designed by Army Design Bureau? Is aimed at enhancing the monitoring and control of generators within the Indian Army. So in fact, this system signifies Indian Army's commitment to leveraging advanced technologies for overall operational efficiency, or further significantly enhancing their overall operational efficiency. When we talk about this Vidyut Rakshak, so Vidyut Rakshak is actually an Internet of Things enabled system. Okay, so Vidyut Rakshak is an Internet of Things enabled system, and that is designed by this ADB, this Army Design Bureau. So that is Army Design Bureau to monitor and protect, control generators within the Indian Army. So in fact, this is one of the innovative innovative method that was developed by the Army Defense Bureau, and this innovation applies to all existing generators regardless of their type, how they manufactured, their rating and age. So that is also one of the key aspects of this Vidyut Rakshak innovation. Now it has certain key features. So what are those key features and important features? So first and foremost, it will lead to the comprehensive monitoring, because Vidyut Rakshak not only monitors the generator's parameters, but it will also predicts and prevents faults and ensuring seamless operation of these generators. And after that, it will also predict the faults, and it will also help prevention of those faults, because this particular system actually anticipates potential faults and also makes preventive measures, reducing the downtime and the maintenance costs as well. And after that, we need to briefly talk about this automation. Okay, so now as of now, this is an automating manual operations. So Vidyut Rakshak actually simplifies the generator management tasks. Now it is not required to manually operate this Vidyut Rakshak, rather it is an automatic. So when it became automatic, so it will lead to the saving of manpower, and it will also significantly improves the operational efficiency of the armed forces also. And apart from that, it also consists of user-friendly interfaces. Okay, so this particular system features user-friendly interface, making it easy for the army personnel to operate and manage these generators effectively and with ease. Okay, so that's all about this Vidyut Rakshak, and thank you so much. So please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. So thank you.